Sir, you need to stand up. That seat isn't yours. The words sliced through the quiet first-class cabin like a blade dragged across glass. For a moment, no one moved. A man in row 2 paused with a crystal tumbler halfway to his lips. Ice clinked softly against the glass. Across the aisle, a silver-haired woman lowered her magazine by half an inch, eyes narrowing over the rim. Seat 1. A. The most expensive seat on Atlantic Crown Airways. Flight 9102 to London. And in that seat sat a man who, to several people in that cabin, did not look like he belonged there. Jordan Hayes didn't answer right away. He simply looked up. 41 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, calm in the way some men become calm after they've spent years making decisions that move entire companies. His charcoal hoodie hung loosely over his frame. The sleeves were pushed back just enough to reveal strong forearms resting on the armrests. He looked tired, not sloppy, not careless. Just tired. The kind of tired that comes from 36 straight hours without sleep. Outside the oval window beside him, rain streaked across the glass at John F. Kennedy International Airport, turning the runway lights into smeared ribbons of red and gold. Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of leather and champagne. And tension. The young flight attendant standing beside Jordan shifted his weight. Mark Reynolds was 27, new to international routes. His uniform was crisp, his smile trained, but the confidence in his posture had started to crack. "Sir," he repeated, voice tighter now, "I'm going to need you to step into the aisle." Jordan blinked slowly. "I'm already in my seat." He spoke quietly. No anger. No attitude. Just a statement. Behind Mark, a woman let out an impatient sigh loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Victoria Langford had been standing in the aisle for nearly 2 minutes now, and patience had never been one of her virtues. 52 years old. Perfectly styled blonde hair. Diamond earrings that caught the cabin light every time she turned her head. A beige Burberry trench draped across her shoulders like a flag of wealth. She looked at Jordan the way someone might look at a stain on a clean tablecloth. Then she laughed. A short, sharp sound. "Oh, for God's sake," she said, loud enough for several passengers to hear. "Mark, do I really have to stand here while you sort this out?" Mark glanced back at her. "Yes, ma'am, just a moment." Victoria tilted her head toward Jordan again, eyes traveling slowly from his sneakers to his hoodie. It wasn't subtle. The message was clear. "This man does not belong here." "Sir," Mark said again, forcing patience into his tone. "We have a seating issue." Jordan leaned back slightly. His fingers tapped once against the leather armrest. "What kind of issue?" Mark hesitated. Because the truth was uncomfortable. The system showed Jordan Hayes assigned to seat 1A. But the woman behind him was a Diamond Elite customer who flew Atlantic Crown almost every week. A donor to the airline's charity foundation. Someone who had, according to quiet rumors among the crew, gotten 2 flight attendants disciplined in the past 5 years. And right now she looked furious. Victoria crossed her arms. "Tell him," she said flatly. Mark exhaled slowly. Mrs. Langford requested seat 1A, due to her status and certain travel accommodations. Jordan's brow lifted just slightly. I bought this seat 3 weeks ago." "I understand that," Mark replied quickly. Victoria laughed again. "Oh, please." "Look at him." The words hung in the air like smoke. 2 businessmen in row 2 exchanged a glance, but said nothing. Cowardice often looked exactly like silence. Victoria stepped forward, leaning slightly into Jordan's personal space. Her perfume was strong, sweet, aggressive. "You can take another seat," she said. "I specifically need the bulkhead." Jordan didn't move. "Do you have a ticket for this seat?" Victoria's smile tightened. "That's not the point." Jordan looked past her at Mark. "It seems like the point." Mark swallowed, because the truth was sitting right there on Jordan's phone screen. Seat 1A, boarding pass valid, no mistake. But Mark's eyes drifted again to Victoria's diamonds, her designer bag. The quiet expectation radiating off her like heat. And then back to the man in the hoodie. A calculation formed. Fast, simple, wrong. "Sir," Mark said finally, voice shifting from polite to firm, "I'm going to ask you to step into the aisle while we verify your credentials." Jordan didn't move. "I just showed you my boarding pass." "Yes, but—" "Then verify it." Mark's jaw tightened. "Sir, you're delaying boarding." From behind him, Victoria scoffed loudly. "Of course he is." A ripple of uncomfortable shifting passed through the cabin. The captain's voice crackled faintly over the intercom from the cockpit. Ground control chatter. Weather updates. Routine sounds of a flight preparing to cross the Atlantic. None of it mattered, because something else had entered the cabin now. Judgment. Mark squared his shoulders. "Sir," he said again, slower this time. "Step into the aisle." Jordan studied his face. Young, nervous, trying to project authority he didn't quite have. Behind him stood Victoria Langford, confident, impatient, certain the world would rearrange itself for her. Jordan exhaled softly. Then slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt. The metal latch clicked in the quiet cabin. Mark stepped back half a step as Jordan stood. Up close, the height difference was noticeable. Jordan Hayes was 6'2", broad shoulders built years ago on a college rowing team. Mark suddenly felt smaller. "Check the passenger manifest," Jordan said quietly. Mark forced a smile. "We will. At the gate podium." Victoria dropped her designer bag directly onto seat 1A the moment Jordan stepped aside. The leather thumped against the cushion. "Well, that wasn't so hard," she muttered. Jordan's eyes flicked to the bag, then to her. And for the first time since this began, something changed in his expression. Not anger, not humiliation. Something colder, almost amused. He turned toward the aisle, toward the open cabin door where rain blurred the lights outside the jet bridge. Behind him, Victoria was already settling into the seat. Champagne arrived moments later. Mark hurried to serve it. The cabin slowly relaxed again. Passengers returned to their drinks, their magazines, their quiet conversations. A problem solved, or so they believed, because none of them noticed the way Jordan Hayes paused halfway down the jet bridge. None of them saw him pull out his phone. None of them knew that the quiet man in the charcoal hoodie wasn't just another traveler. He was the reason Atlantic Crown Airways' entire digital backbone was still running. And 5 minutes from now, every system that airline depended on would be waiting for one thing: his decision. Jordan Hayes stepped out of the jet bridge and into the humid evening air of Terminal 4 at JFK. The sound of the rain grew louder the moment the aircraft door closed behind him. Not a storm yet, just steady rain, the kind that blurred runway lights into long red streaks across wet concrete. People rushed past him with rolling suitcases, the rhythm of wheels tapping against the tile floor. Nobody looked at him twice, which was exactly how Jordan preferred it. He stopped beside a wide glass wall overlooking the runway and slipped his phone from the pocket of his hoodie. His reflection hovered faintly in the glass. Calm face, tired eyes. Nothing about him suggested the kind of authority that could stop an airline in its tracks. That anonymity had protected him for years. Tonight, it had just cost Atlantic Crown Airways more than they could imagine. Behind him, the boarding announcement for Flight 9102 echoed through the terminal speakers. The gate agent was calling final passengers. The aircraft would push back in minutes. Jordan glanced down at his phone. One notification blinked quietly across the screen. Orion Nexus Admin Console. Access level. Executive override. His thumb hovered above the screen for a moment. Not hesitation. Calculation. Because this was not a tantrum, not revenge, not some emotional impulse. This was leverage. 36 hours earlier, Jordan had been in Singapore dealing with a cascading server failure across 3 continents. The same software architecture that kept global cargo networks running, that optimized airport logistics, that balanced airline crew schedules down to the minute. Orion Nexus didn't just provide software. It was infrastructure. Invisible, silent, buried beneath the daily operations of companies too large to function without it. Atlantic Crown Airways was one of their biggest clients, or at least it had been. Jordan tapped once on the screen and opened the client directory. A long list of corporations appeared. Banks, shipping conglomerates, satellite networks, logistics chains. Then he found it. Atlantic Crown Airways, Enterprise Tier Client. Active beta license for Orion Nexus Flight Grid AI. Status, Trial Mode. Jordan breathed out slowly. Flight Grid was the brain behind half of Atlantic Crown's daily operations. Crew assignments, fuel logistics, flight planning, real-time aircraft telemetry routing through cloud servers scattered across 3 continents. The airline liked to pretend it was their own proprietary system. Marketing language did that. Reality was simpler. Without Orion Nexus, their system had the operational intelligence of a calculator from the 1990s. Jordan leaned against the glass wall and watched the aircraft that had just removed him begin to move slowly across the wet tarmac. The Boeing 777 looked graceful even in the rain, nose turning toward the taxiway. Inside that aircraft, Victoria Langford was probably stretching her legs into seat 1A right now, champagne in hand, smiling to herself, believing she had just won a small, petty victory over a stranger in a hoodie. Jordan almost admired the confidence. What she didn't know was that the seat she had taken belonged to the man currently holding the digital keys to her airline's nervous system. He opened another screen. Authorization required. Biometric confirmation. Jordan pressed his thumb gently against the sensor. The phone vibrated once. Executive access granted. Back inside the aircraft, the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the engines spooled up. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Brooks adjusted his headset and scanned the flight display. 48 years old, former Air Force pilot, calm under pressure. He had flown across the Atlantic hundreds of times. Nothing about tonight felt unusual yet. Ground control, Atlantic Crown 9102. Ready for pushback, he said into the radio. The reply crackled back through static. Atlantic Crown 9102. Pushback approved. Hydraulic motors whined beneath the aircraft. The jet bridge pulled away. The aircraft began reversing slowly from the gate. In the first-class cabin, Victoria Langford swirled the champagne in her glass with mild irritation. Honestly, she muttered to Mark Reynolds, standing beside her, some people just love causing scenes. Mark forced a polite smile. His hands were still slightly shaky from the confrontation earlier. Yes, ma'am. Victoria settled deeper into the leather seat. At least you handled it. Mark nodded quickly. Of course. But something in the back of his mind kept replaying Jordan Hayes's final look before leaving the cabin. Not angry, not embarrassed, almost patient. The aircraft rolled slowly across the taxiway. Rain tapped against the fuselage like scattered pebbles. Captain Brooks glanced down at his primary flight display, then frowned. The screen flickered. Just once. Did you see that? The first officer asked quietly. Brooks leaned closer. The navigation map blinked. For a moment, every waypoint disappeared. Then the screen rebooted. A thin line of text appeared across the center of the display. License validation error. Brooks straightened in his seat. What the hell? Back inside Terminal 4, Jordan Hayes watched the aircraft's navigation lights glow faintly through the rain as it approached the runway queue. His phone buzzed again. Alert, client system request pending. The airline's servers had already noticed the license discrepancy. Jordan opened the final menu. Suspend client services. The warning message appeared instantly. This action will disable Orion Nexus infrastructure access for Atlantic Crown Airways. Operational disruptions likely. He stared at the screen for a moment, not thinking about Victoria Langford, not thinking about Mark Reynolds. He was thinking about principle, because power meant nothing if it allowed people to erase your dignity the moment you walked into a room wearing the wrong clothes. Jordan pressed the button. Across the Atlantic Crown Operations Center in Dallas, Texas, dozens of monitoring screens suddenly flashed red. One by one, the data streams vanished. Crew allocation servers dropped offline. Fuel routing algorithms crashed. Flight grid AI disconnected from the airline network. Inside the cockpit of Flight 9102, the navigation display went black. Captain Brooks felt a cold wave rise up his spine. The system rebooted again. This time the message was different. License expired. Contact system administrator. Brooks stared at the screen in disbelief. Behind him, 30,000 pounds of jet fuel vibrated through the wings as the aircraft rolled toward the runway. Inside the cabin, Victoria Langford took another sip of champagne. And thousands of miles away, a digital switch had just turned Atlantic Crown Airways into the most expensive grounded airline in modern aviation. Captain Daniel Brooks stared at the dark navigation display as if the screen itself had betrayed him. The aircraft continued rolling slowly along the rain-slick taxiway, engines humming with the steady power of a machine built for long-distance flight. Yet the cockpit suddenly felt much smaller. The first officer tapped the screen once with 2 fingers, as if that simple gesture might wake it back up. Nothing happened. The line of text remained frozen across the glass. License expired. Contact System Administrator. "What system just dropped?" Brooks asked quietly. The first officer leaned closer, scrolling through backup pages. Flight grid link just died. Brooks's jaw tightened. Flight grid was the airline's backbone for flight planning and routing. It fed real-time data into the aircraft's flight management computer. Without it, the jet could still fly, but the automated routing across the Atlantic corridor depended on that data stream. "Try rebooting the interface," Brooks said. The first officer flipped a breaker switch beneath the panel. The screen blinked once more. The system restarted. Waypoints appeared for half a second, then vanished again. License expired. "Jesus," the first officer muttered. Behind them, the cabin remained blissfully unaware. Passengers were settling into seats, fastening belts, adjusting reading lights. The soft clink of glasses and the murmur of quiet conversations floated faintly through the cockpit door. In seat 1, a Victoria Langford stretched her legs and checked her reflection in the dark screen of her phone. The champagne had improved her mood considerably. "You see?" she said to Mark Reynolds, standing nearby. "That's what happens when you handle things properly." Mark nodded, but his smile was thinner now. Something about the way the man in the hoodie had walked off the plane kept replaying in his mind. Calm, controlled, as if he knew something none of them did. A chime sounded overhead as the aircraft slowed on the taxiway. The captain's voice came through the cabin speakers, calm but tighter than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a minor technical issue with one of our flight planning systems. We're going to pause here for a few minutes while our crew runs a reset." A few passengers glanced up. Most didn't care. Victoria rolled her eyes. "Of course," she muttered. "Typical." Back in Dallas, the Atlantic Crown Airways Operations Center looked like a cathedral of screens. Long rows of glowing monitors tracked aircraft across the world map. Lines of data scrolled across displays showing crew assignments, fuel calculations, baggage routing, passenger check-ins. At least that's how it usually looked. At 6:22 in the evening Eastern Time, the screens began turning red, one after another. A systems engineer named Luis Ortega blinked at his console. What the hell? The crew allocation dashboard vanished. He tried reopening the program. Error. Across the room, another operator raised his voice. "I just lost Miami check-in servers." A third operator slammed a keyboard. "Chicago baggage routing offline." Luis's hands moved quickly over the keys. "Reconnecting to flight grid network." The command returned a single response. "Connection refused." The shift supervisor stood from his chair. What's going on? Louise turned toward him slowly. I think we just lost Orion Nexus. The supervisor's face went blank. That's not possible. Across the room, another alarm chimed. Fuel routing down. Telemetry link dropped for 6 aircraft. Dispatch systems frozen. Within 30 seconds, the operations floor filled with overlapping voices. What's happening to the network? Why are all the aircraft feeds disappearing? Louise swallowed hard, because he knew exactly what Orion Nexus did, and what happened when it vanished. It's not a glitch, he said quietly. It's a shutdown. Back at JFK Flight 9102 had come to a complete stop on the taxiway. Rain drummed steadily against the fuselage. The engines idled impatiently. Captain Brooks spoke into the radio. Ground control, Atlantic Crown, 9102 holding position due to system failure. Static crackled. Atlantic Crown 9102, copy that. Advise when ready to proceed. Brooks leaned back in his seat. We're not proceeding anywhere. The first officer nodded grimly. We've lost the digital flight plan. Without a validated flight plan filed through the airline network, the aircraft could not legally depart for an international crossing. Aviation regulations were not flexible about that. Brooks rubbed his temple. Call dispatch. The first officer pressed the headset switch. Nothing. The communication panel remained silent. Dispatch link is dead, he said. Brooks stared through the rain-streaked windshield. The runway lights glowed faintly ahead of them like distant beacons. Behind him, nearly 300 passengers waited in the cabin. And somewhere in the airline's network, a system administrator had just pulled a plug that nobody in this cockpit could reach. Back in first class, Victoria Langford noticed the delay stretching longer. Mark, she said sharply. Yes, ma'am. How long is this going to take? I'm sure just a few minutes. She leaned back and sighed dramatically. This airline is becoming impossible. Across the aisle, a businessman lowered his laptop. Technical problems happen, he said calmly. Victoria shot him an icy look. Well, they shouldn't. Mark forced another polite smile and moved toward the galley. But when he reached the curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin, he paused. Because the captain's voice had returned over the intercom, and this time it didn't sound calm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently experiencing a larger systems outage affecting our flight planning network. For safety reasons, we cannot depart until the issue is resolved. A ripple of uneasy whispers spread through the cabin. Victoria frowned. What does that mean? No one answered. Miles away in Terminal 4. Jordan Hayes stepped into the back seat of a waiting black sedan. The driver glanced at him through the mirror. Where to, sir? Jordan leaned back against the leather seat and watched rain slide down the window. Manhattan. The car pulled away from the curb. His phone vibrated softly. A new message appeared from Orion Nexus monitoring servers. Client network disconnected successfully. Operational impact expanding. Jordan looked out at the runway lights fading behind him. Inside the aircraft he had just left, nearly 300 passengers were sitting in a metal tube that no longer knew how to fly itself across the ocean. And somewhere in Dallas, an entire airline was beginning to understand a brutal truth. They had just thrown the most important passenger on that plane off the aircraft. The operations floor in Dallas was no longer quiet. It sounded like a control room during a power failure, except nothing had gone dark all at once. Instead, the systems were dying piece by piece, like organs shutting down in slow motion. Luis Ortega stared at his monitor as another red warning box flashed across the screen. Crew scheduling offline. He hit the reconnect command again. Same response. Connection refused. Behind him, a chair scraped loudly across the floor as the shift supervisor stood up. His name was Carl Bennett, and he had worked airline operations for almost 20 years. He had seen weather shutdowns, cyber attacks, even a satellite outage once. But this felt different. This felt surgical. "What exactly are we losing?" Carl asked. Luis swallowed. "Everything tied to Flight Grid." Carl's face hardened. Flight Grid was the system Atlantic Crown relied on to track aircraft, schedule pilots, manage routes, balance fuel loads. Without it, the airline was blind. Across the room, another operator shouted, "We just lost dispatch control for the entire East Coast corridor." Someone else slammed a headset down on the desk. "Phones are blowing up. JFK, Miami, Chicago, LAX. Nobody can access the flight plans." Carl walked quickly across the room to a wall-sized display showing aircraft across North America. Normally, hundreds of green markers crawled across the map like living things. Now half of them were grey. Disconnected. Carl leaned closer to the screen. "How many flights are affected?" Luis checked the system logs. His voice was quieter now. "All of them." Back on the taxiway at JFK, the cabin air inside Flight 9102 had started to shift. At first, it was subtle. Passengers looking up from their phones. A few glances exchanged between rows. 10 minutes had passed, then 15. In first class, Victoria Langford set her empty champagne flute down on the tray table with a soft but irritated click. "Mark." The flight attendant turned quickly. "Yes, Mrs. Langford." "This is ridiculous. Why are we still sitting here?" Mark forced another professional smile, but the tension around his eyes had deepened. "The cockpit is still working through a systems reset, ma'am." Victoria crossed her arms. "You people said that 20 minutes ago." Across the aisle, the businessman who had spoken earlier closed his laptop. "Relax," he said calmly. "Better to fix something on the ground than at 30,000 feet. Victoria shot him a look sharp enough to slice through metal. "That's easy for you to say. Some of us actually have important schedules." Mark shifted his weight slightly. "I'll check with the cockpit." He pulled the curtain aside and stepped into the galley, the smile vanishing from his face the moment the passengers couldn't see him. Susan Miller stood near the coffee machine, arms folded tightly. "How bad?" she asked. Mark lowered his voice. "Captain says dispatch link is dead. They can't retrieve the updated flight plan." Susan frowned. "That's impossible." "Apparently not." She glanced toward the cabin where Victoria was now tapping impatient fingers against the armrest of seat 1A. Susan exhaled slowly. "All right, we wait." Mark hesitated. Then he said it. "You remember the guy we moved earlier?" Susan's eyes narrowed slightly. "The one in the hoodie?" "Yeah." Mark rubbed the back of his neck. He looked too calm. Susan gave him a hard look. Don't start second-guessing yourself now. I'm not, Mark said quickly, but his stomach disagreed. Back in Dallas, the phone on Carl Bennett's desk rang again. He snatched it up. Operations, a voice exploded through the line. What the hell is going on over there? Carl recognized the voice instantly. Michael Carter, Chief Operating Officer of Atlantic Crown Airways. Carl straightened instinctively. Sir, we've lost connectivity to the flight grid infrastructure. What do you mean, lost connectivity? The system just dropped offline. Michael's voice sharpened. Bring it back. We're trying. Trying isn't good enough. Carl stared at the wall map where another aircraft marker had just turned grey. Sir, I don't think we can. Silence filled the line for a few seconds. Then Michael spoke again, slower. Explain. Carl looked at Luis. Luis nodded grimly. Carl spoke carefully. Flight Grid isn't hosted on our internal network. I know that. It runs through Orion Nexus cloud architecture. Another pause. Then Michael said 2 quiet words. Oh no. Across the taxiway, Captain Daniel Brooks leaned forward over the flight console. Still nothing. The navigation systems remained frozen. The first officer tapped the radio switch again. Dispatch, this is Atlantic Crown 9102. Do you copy? Only static answered. Brooks glanced down the long, wet runway, stretching ahead into the darkness. Then he flipped the cabin intercom switch. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking again. His voice was steady, but now every word carried weight. We're experiencing a larger operational outage affecting our flight systems. At this time, we cannot safely depart. A wave of murmurs rolled through the cabin like distant thunder. Victoria Langford sat up straighter. What does that mean exactly? Mark returned to the aisle, his posture now tighter. We're just waiting for clearance from operations. How long? I don't know. Victoria stared at him. You don't know? The businessman across the aisle watched quietly. Then he said softly, Maybe the universe is telling you something. Victoria turned toward him with open irritation. What is that supposed to mean? He shrugged. Sometimes when things go wrong, it's because someone made a bad decision. Mark felt his throat tighten. Because he suddenly realized something. The timing. The system failure had happened minutes after Jordan Hayes left the aircraft. And now, an entire airline network was collapsing. Back in the black sedan, moving through wet Manhattan traffic, Jordan Hayes leaned his head back against the seat. The city lights smeared across the window in long golden streaks. His phone vibrated again. Another alert from Orion Nexus. Global client impact expanding. Atlantic Crown Airways operational network disconnected. Estimated disruption window escalating. Jordan watched the rain for a long moment. Then he whispered quietly to himself. They should have checked the passenger list. Michael Carter was already running before the elevator doors had finished opening. The corridor outside the executive offices in Dallas felt suddenly too small. Phones were ringing behind every closed door. Assistants were standing in hallways with tablets pressed to their chests, whispering into headsets. The calm rhythm of a normal evening operation had been replaced by a sharp electric panic that moved through the building like a storm front. Michael pushed through the glass doors of the operations center. The room looked different now. It always had noise. Every airline operations floor did. But this was chaos layered on top of noise. Voices overlapping, chairs scraping, dozens of screens glowing red where green flight paths used to crawl slowly across digital maps. Carl Bennett spotted him first. "Sir." Michael didn't slow down. "Tell me exactly what happened." Carl gestured toward Luis Ortega's console. "We lost Orion Nexus connectivity across the entire network." Michael's face hardened. "That system doesn't just drop." Louise looked up from the keyboard. "It didn't drop." Michael stared at him. Louise swallowed once before finishing the sentence. It was shut off. The words landed in the room like a physical weight. Michael stepped closer to the monitor. "Explain." Louise pulled up a system log. Lines of code scrolled across the screen until one line stopped blinking. "Client services suspended. Authorization level. Executive override." Michael leaned closer. "Who authorized it?" Louise hesitated. "The key belongs to Orion Nexus." Michael's voice dropped lower. "I know that." Another pause. Louise cleared his throat. "But the override request came directly from the CEO tier account." Michael felt something cold slide through his chest. He knew exactly how many people had access to that level of authority. 1. Back at JFK, the cabin of Flight 9102 had grown louder. The quiet murmur from earlier had turned into restless shifting and sharp whispers passing from row to row. People were checking watches, pulling out phones. Some were already typing messages. In first class, Victoria Langford had abandoned patience entirely. She stood up. Mark Reynolds moved toward her immediately. "Ma'am, please remain seated. I have been seated for 40 minutes, she snapped. "What exactly is the problem?" Mark kept his voice even. "The captain is waiting for an updated flight plan from operations." Victoria laughed harshly. "You're an international airline. You're telling me you lost a piece of paper?" Across the aisle, the businessman who had been watching quietly spoke again. "It's not paper anymore," he said calmly. Victoria turned toward him. "Well, clearly it's not working either." He studied her for a moment. "Maybe the wrong passenger got removed from the plane." The words cut through the air like a razor. Mark felt heat rush into his neck. Victoria frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" The man leaned back in his seat. "Just an observation." Victoria scoffed and sat down again with exaggerated irritation. Ridiculous. But the words stayed hanging in the cabin. Wrong passenger. Inside the cockpit, Captain Daniel Brooks rubbed his eyes. Dispatch still wasn't answering. The digital flight plan remained gone. The first officer looked over from his screen. "If operations doesn't reconnect the system soon, we'll have to tow back to the gate." Brooks nodded slowly. "And if the gate system is down too?" The first officer didn't answer, because both men knew the answer already. Then Brooks picked up the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're still working through a network outage affecting our flight planning system. At this time, we're unable to depart." Groans rippled through the cabin. Someone near row 3 said loudly, "You've got to be kidding me." Back in Dallas, Michael Carter stared at the system logs. The override command had come through less than 10 minutes after Flight 9102 pushed back from the gate. 10 minutes. His mind moved quickly now. He turned toward Carl. What happened on that aircraft before pushback? Carl blinked. "Sir?" Michael's voice sharpened. "Call the station manager at JFK right now." Carl grabbed a phone immediately. Across the room, Luis watched Michael with quiet dread. Because the system logs were still open on his screen, and one name had already appeared in the authorization chain. Jordan Hayes. Luis had heard the name before. Anyone in airline operations had. The founder of Orion Nexus, the man whose infrastructure ran half the airline networks on the planet. Luis looked slowly back at the red screens surrounding them, then back at the name. Jordan Hayes. In Manhattan, the black sedan rolled slowly through wet traffic near Park Avenue. Jordan Hayes sat quietly in the back seat, one arm resting along the door. The city outside moved in reflections and rain streaks. The driver glanced at him through the mirror. Busy night at the airport? Jordan gave a faint smile. You could say that. His phone buzzed again. New alert. Atlantic Crown Network requesting emergency reconnect. Jordan looked at the message, then locked the screen without responding. The sedan turned onto a quieter street, lined with tall buildings and soft yellow lights glowing behind rain-stained windows. Jordan's thoughts drifted back briefly to the aircraft, to Mark Reynolds standing nervously in the aisle, to Victoria Langford claiming seat 1A like it was a throne she had always owned, to the way the cabin had looked when he stood up, a room full of people who had already decided who mattered and who didn't. He exhaled slowly. Power was rarely loud. Real power was quiet. It waited. It watched. And when the moment came, it didn't raise its voice. It flipped a switch. Miles away on a dark taxiway at JFK, nearly 300 passengers sat in a grounded aircraft, while an entire airline tried to understand why its digital brain had suddenly gone silent. And none of them knew the simplest truth yet. The man they had removed from seat 1A was the same man who had just turned their entire airline off. The phone rang twice before the station manager at JFK answered. Atlantic Crown Operations, Carl Bennett spoke quickly. This is Dallas Control. I need you to confirm something immediately. What happened on Flight 9102 before pushback? There was a pause on the other end. Why? Carl looked toward Michael Carter, who was standing beside him with his arms folded tightly across his chest. Because the entire airline just lost Orion Nexus. Silence flooded the line. Then the station manager exhaled slowly. Hold on. Papers shuffled. Voices moved faintly in the background. When the man returned to the line, his voice had changed. There was an incident in first class. Michael leaned forward. What kind of incident? A passenger dispute over seat 1A. Michael blinked. That's it? Well, the passenger assigned to the seat was removed from the aircraft. Michael's voice dropped. Removed? Yes, sir. For what reason? Another pause. Crew said there was a conflict with a Diamond Elite passenger. Michael closed his eyes for a moment. Who was the passenger removed? More shuffling, keys clicking. Then the station manager read the name slowly from the manifest. Jordan Hayes. The operations center in Dallas went silent. Luis Ortega stopped typing. Carl Bennett stopped breathing. Michael Carter felt the blood drain from his face. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Michael whispered one sentence. "You threw him off the plane." Back at JFK, the rain had grown heavier. Flight 9102 sat alone on the taxiway, like a stranded animal surrounded by blinking runway lights. The engines hummed patiently, but the aircraft had not moved for nearly an hour. Inside the cabin, the mood had shifted from irritation to something sharper. People were restless now. Phones were out. Messages were being sent. A young man near row 4 leaned into the aisle. "Hey, are we going back to the gate or what?" Mark Reynolds forced another smile. "We're still waiting for instructions." "For an hour?" Mark didn't answer. Across the aisle, the businessman from earlier was watching everything quietly. His name was Thomas Garrett, though no one in the cabin knew that. 58 years old, corporate attorney, a man who had spent 3 decades studying how power moved through institutions, and what he was watching now felt familiar. Victoria Langford snapped her seatbelt open again. "That's it." Mark stepped toward her quickly. "Ma'am, please remain seated." "No." Her voice rose enough for half the cabin to hear. "I paid $12,000 for this seat, and I am not sitting here all night while your airline collapses." Thomas Garrett lifted an eyebrow. "That might be exactly what's happening." Victoria turned toward him again, fury flashing across her face. "Oh, please." "You think this delay is about weather?" Thomas said calmly. She scoffed. "You think it's about that man you people made such a fuss over earlier?" Mark's stomach tightened. "Because the way Thomas said, you people felt deliberate." Thomas leaned back slightly. "I think sometimes the smallest decisions have the largest consequences." Victoria laughed. "That man didn't belong in first class." The words landed hard in the quiet cabin. Several passengers glanced toward her. Thomas Garrett studied her for a moment. Then he said quietly, "You might want to hope he did." In Dallas, Michael Carter was already moving. "Get the CEO on the line," he said sharply. Carl nodded and grabbed another phone. Michael walked toward the wall screen, showing the airline's fleet. More aircraft icons had turned gray, disconnected. "How long before the system collapse spreads?" Michael asked without turning. Luis answered from behind his monitor. "It already has." Michael looked over his shoulder. Luis swallowed. "We've lost crew scheduling across the entire network. Dispatch can't generate flight plans. Check-in systems are crashing one airport at a time." Michael ran a hand across his face. "How many flights are grounded?" Luis didn't want to answer, but he did. "All of them." The number echoed across the room. "All." Michael's voice turned colder. "Where is Jordan Hayes right now?" Carl checked the passenger records. He left the airport. "Find him. We're trying. Try harder." Michael's eyes were fixed on the frozen aircraft icons across the map, because he understood something the others didn't yet. This wasn't a technical failure. This was leverage. In Manhattan, the sedan slowed beside the entrance of the Four Seasons. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Jordan Hayes climbed out into the rain. The doorman nodded politely. "Good evening, sir." Jordan nodded back and stepped inside. The lobby was quiet. Warm lighting reflecting off marble floors. The low hum of conversations from guests seated in leather chairs near the bar. Normal life. A world completely unaware that several thousand feet away, an entire airline was fighting for survival. Jordan walked slowly toward the elevator. His phone vibrated again. Another message from Orion Nexus Monitoring. Atlantic Crown executive attempting emergency contact. Jordan glanced at the screen, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. The elevator doors opened. Inside the aircraft at JFK, the tension had reached a breaking point. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, whispering to Mark. His face changed immediately. "What? The captain just got word from operations." Mark frowned. "What word?" The attendant lowered her voice. "They're trying to locate a passenger who got off the plane earlier." Mark felt a chill move through his chest. "Why?" She hesitated. Then she whispered the sentence that made the world tilt sideways. "Because he's the CEO of Orion Nexus." Mark stared at her. The cabin lights hummed softly overhead. Victoria Langford shifted impatiently in seat 1A. And suddenly, Mark Reynolds understood exactly what kind of mistake they had made. Mark Reynolds felt the blood drain from his face. "Say that again." The junior flight attendant glanced nervously toward the cockpit door before whispering again. "He's the CEO of Orion Nexus." For a moment, Mark just stared at her. The noise of the cabin seemed to fade away. Conversations blurred into distant hums. The low rumble of the engines vibrated through the floor beneath his shoes. "Jordan Hayes?" Mark asked quietly. She nodded once. "That's what operations said." Mark turned slowly toward seat 1A. Victoria Langford was scrolling through her phone with the irritated impatience of someone who believed inconvenience was a personal insult. She looked perfectly comfortable, perfectly confident. The champagne flute on her tray table was empty. Mark suddenly felt something twist inside his stomach, because he knew exactly what Orion Nexus was. Everyone in aviation knew. Their systems ran cargo routing, crew scheduling, flight optimization. Half the airlines in the country depended on their cloud architecture to function, and the man they had just escorted off the aircraft was the one person who could turn it off. Mark's voice dropped. "Does the captain know?" "Yeah," the attendant said quietly. "And operations?" "They're freaking out." Across the aisle, Thomas Garrett had been watching their whispered conversation carefully. He didn't hear the words, but he read the body language easily. The sudden stiffness, the pale faces, the quick glance toward seat 1A. A lawyer's instincts kicked in. Something had shifted. Thomas leaned slightly into the aisle. "Everything all right up there?" he asked calmly. Mark forced a smile. "Yes, sir." Thomas studied him. "No, it isn't." Mark didn't answer, because at that exact moment, the cockpit door opened. Captain Daniel Brooks stepped out into the aisle. His face looked different now. Not the composed calm of a pilot managing a delay. This was something else. He walked directly to Mark. "Come with me." Mark followed him toward the galley. Susan Miller was already there waiting, arms folded tight. Brooks spoke in a low voice. Operations confirmed it. Susan frowned. Confirmed what? Brooks didn't hesitate. The passenger we removed earlier is Jordan Hayes. The words hung in the narrow galley like a live wire. Susan's expression didn't change at first. Then it did. Slowly. Her eyes narrowed. You're kidding. I wish I was. Mark swallowed hard. The Orion Nexus guy? Brooks nodded. Yes. Silence filled the space for several seconds. Susan ran a hand across her forehead. Tell me we're not thinking what I think we're thinking. Brooks answered quietly. Every major system we just lost runs through Orion Nexus. Mark whispered. You think he did this? Brooks held his gaze. I think we kicked the wrong man off this plane. Back in Dallas, the operations center had become a battlefield. Phones rang non-stop. Operators shouted across desks. Luis Ortega stared at a new screen filled with incoming alerts. System failure reports were spreading across the country. Atlanta check-in offline. Chicago baggage routing frozen. Los Angeles crew scheduling inaccessible. Each failure stacked on top of the next. Carl Bennett stood beside Michael Carter, phone pressed tightly to his ear. Yes, sir, Carl said quickly. We confirmed it. Michael's voice was barely audible through the line. And? Carl glanced towards the wall of red screens. It's him. Another long silence passed before Michael spoke again. Where is he? We're tracking his last location, leaving JFK. Track faster. Carl nodded, even though Michael couldn't see him. Yes, sir. Carl lowered the phone slowly. The operations floor buzzed with frantic movement around him, but for a moment he stood completely still. Because every airline executive knew the same unwritten rule. Never anger the people who run the infrastructure. And tonight, Atlantic Crown had just humiliated the man who owned it. In Manhattan, Jordan Hayes stepped into the quiet elevator and pressed the button for the restaurant floor. The doors closed softly. Inside, the mirrored walls reflected his tired face back at him. He loosened the cuff of his hoodie slightly. The adrenaline from earlier had faded now, replaced by something calmer. Outside the glass wall of the elevator, the lights of Midtown slid past in golden streaks. His phone buzzed again. Incoming call. Michael Carter. Jordan looked at the screen for a moment, then let it ring. The elevator chimed softly, and the doors opened onto a dimly lit restaurant floor. Soft jazz drifted through the air. Waiters moved between tables, carrying plates of expensive food and quiet conversations. Normal life continued. Jordan stepped out of the elevator and walked toward the host stand. Table for one, he said calmly. The hostess smiled politely. Of course, Mr. Hayes. He paused slightly. How did you know my name? She gestured toward the reservation screen. You're already on the list, Jordan nodded. Of course he was. He followed her through the restaurant toward a quiet corner table near the window overlooking Park Avenue. Meanwhile, several miles away at JFK, the tension inside Flight 9102 had turned thick. Passengers were no longer whispering. They were asking questions, loudly. A woman near row 5 stood up. How much longer is this going to take? Another voice called out from the back. Just let us off the plane. Victoria Langford rolled her eyes dramatically. This airline is unbelievable. Thomas Garrett watched the chaos build around them. Then he looked toward Mark Reynolds, standing frozen near the galley. And for the first time, he saw real fear in the young man's eyes. Thomas leaned slightly across the aisle toward Victoria. "You know," he said quietly. "What? Sometimes the person you step on is the one holding the ladder." Victoria frowned. "I don't know what you're talking about." Thomas gave a small, thoughtful smile. "You will." The first call came while Jordan Hayes was halfway through his steak. The phone vibrated once against the white tablecloth, a low mechanical hum that almost blended with the soft jazz drifting through the restaurant. Jordan glanced down at the screen without touching it. Michael Carter. Again. Jordan cut another piece of meat slowly, chewing with the calm patience of someone who had already made every decision that mattered. Outside the window, Park Avenue glittered with wet reflections from passing headlights. Manhattan looked peaceful tonight, like a city that had nothing to do with the chaos spreading through the aviation industry. The phone stopped vibrating. Then it started again. Same name. Jordan let it ring. Across the restaurant, a television above the bar switched from a baseball replay to a red banner headline. Airline network outage disrupts hundreds of flights. No one in the room noticed Jordan glance briefly toward the screen. Back in Dallas, the operations center had crossed the invisible line between confusion and panic. Michael Carter stood in the middle of the floor now, tie loosened, sleeves rolled back. The calm executive demeanor he carried through boardrooms and investor calls was gone. What remained was a man watching his airline collapse in real time. "How many aircraft are currently grounded?" he demanded. Luis Ortega answered without looking up from the monitors. 214. Michael felt the number land like a punch to the ribs. And departures? 0. Carl Bennett stepped closer. "We've got passengers trapped on taxiways, gates filling up with delayed flights, check-in systems failing across multiple airports." Michael rubbed both hands across his face. "What about manual dispatch?" Luis shook his head. "Without Flight Grid, we can't generate legal flight plans for international routes. FAA regulations require digital verification through the network." Michael's voice dropped lower. "So we're not flying anywhere." Luis finally looked up. "No, sir." Across the room, another operator shouted, "New York is calling again." Carl grabbed the phone and pressed it to his ear. "JFK operations." A strained voice exploded through the line. "You need to give us something. We've got 3 aircraft sitting on taxiways with no instructions." Carl looked toward Michael. Michael exhaled slowly. "Tell them to hold position." Carl repeated the order. Then he hung up and turned back. Michael's eyes were already moving again, calculating damage the way executives learned to do when disaster struck. "How much is this costing us per hour?" Luis answered quietly. "About $10 million. The room went still. $10 million an hour. Michael stared at the red aircraft icons across the digital map. Then he looked down at the phone in his hand. Jordan Hayes. Back on flight 9102. The temperature inside the cabin had started creeping upward. The engines had been idling too long. Air circulation felt stale. The scent of champagne, perfume, and recycled air mixed into something uncomfortable. Passengers were standing in the aisles now. A man near row 6 leaned over a seat. "Why can't they just let us back to the gate?" Mark Reynolds didn't have an answer anymore. Because the truth had just arrived from operations. The gate system was down too. Captain Brooks stepped into the aisle again, voice heavier than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're working with ground operations to move the aircraft. At the moment, we're waiting for manual clearance." Someone from the back shouted, "Manual clearance for what?" Brooks didn't answer. Because the explanation would sound insane. The airline's entire digital nervous system had just vanished. Victoria Langford slammed her tray table shut. "This is unacceptable." Thomas Garrett watched her quietly. "You're still convinced this has nothing to do with earlier?" She glared at him. That man had nothing to do with this. Thomas leaned back. "Maybe." Victoria folded her arms. "You really think one random passenger can shut down an airline?" Thomas didn't smile. "No." He paused. "Not a random one." Mark overheard the exchange. His throat tightened. Because now, every time he looked down the aisle, he could still picture Jordan Hayes standing there calmly while they told him to leave. The same calm expression, the same steady voice. And suddenly the pieces were starting to fit together in ways Mark wished they wouldn't. Back in Manhattan, the waiter placed a glass of Cabernet beside Jordan's plate. "Another drink, sir." "Thank you." The waiter hesitated slightly. "Busy night for airlines, huh?" Jordan glanced up. "You saw the news?" The waiter nodded toward the television. "Looks like some big outage." Jordan took a slow sip of wine. "Technology can be fragile." Across the room, the television anchor's voice rose slightly. Atlantic Crown Airways confirming major network disruptions affecting flights nationwide. Jordan set the glass down gently. His phone vibrated again. Michael Carter. Jordan finally picked it up, but instead of answering, he turned the screen face down on the table. Back in Dallas, Michael stared at the call timer. No answer. He lowered the phone slowly. Carl spoke quietly beside him. "He's not picking up?" Michael shook his head once. Carl hesitated. "What do we do now?" Michael looked around the operations floor. The red screens, the frantic staff, the phones ringing endlessly. For the first time in 20 years of airline management, he had no immediate solution. Then Luis spoke from across the room. "Sir." Michael turned. Luis rotated his monitor toward him. A news alert was flashing across multiple feeds. "Atlantic Crown Airways Network collapse trends worldwide." Michael stared at the headline. His airline had just become the story. And somewhere in Manhattan, the one man who could stop it was quietly finishing dinner. Michael Carter grabbed his coat before the elevator doors had fully opened. "Get the car ready," he said to the assistant standing frozen outside his office. The young woman blinked. "Sir?" "Now." Within seconds, the hallway outside the executive floor was moving again. Phones were still ringing behind closed doors. Screens inside the operations center continued glowing red. But Michael no longer cared about the room he had just left. Because the problem was no longer inside the building. The problem was sitting somewhere in Manhattan, finishing dinner. The elevator doors slid shut. Michael stared at his phone while the numbers ticked downward toward the lobby. Jordan Hayes. He pressed the call button again. Ring. Ring. No answer. The elevator reached the ground floor with a soft chime. Michael stepped out quickly and headed toward the waiting black sedan outside the building. The driver opened the door. "Where to, sir?" Michael slid into the back seat. "Four Seasons, Manhattan." The car pulled away from the curb. Back at JFK, the aircraft cabin had turned restless. Passengers were no longer whispering. They were angry. A man near row 7 raised his voice toward the front of the cabin. "You've got to let us off this plane." Another passenger added, "We've been sitting here for 2 hours." Captain Brooks stepped forward again, his calm voice beginning to show strain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are waiting for ground operations to manually guide the aircraft back to the gate." A woman shouted from the back. "Manually guide?" Brooks nodded once. "Our automated systems are currently offline." The explanation only made the cabin louder. Victoria Langford threw both hands into the air. "This is insanity." Thomas Garrett leaned slightly toward her. "You're starting to sound worried." She turned sharply. "I am not worried." Thomas studied her quietly. "Then why does your voice keep getting louder?" Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but stopped, because for the first time that night, the cabin lights flickered. Just once. A ripple of uneasy silence passed through the rows. Mark Reynolds looked toward the ceiling panels, then toward the cockpit, because flickering lights meant something deeper was happening inside the aircraft systems. Back in Manhattan, Jordan Hayes finished the last bite of steak and set the knife carefully beside the plate. The waiter returned with the check. "No rush, sir." Jordan nodded politely. The television behind the bar was now running continuous coverage of the airline outage. Footage showed stranded passengers standing in airport terminals across the country. A reporter spoke over the images, Atlantic Crown Airways confirming that all flights remain grounded due to a critical infrastructure failure. Jordan glanced at the screen. Then he reached for his phone. 47 missed calls. Michael Carter. Jordan scrolled through them slowly. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked out the restaurant window. Rain still drifted across Park Avenue in thin silver lines. The world outside seemed completely normal. Inside the aviation industry, everything had stopped. He pressed one button. The phone began dialing. Miles away, Michael Carter's phone rang inside the back seat of the moving sedan. He snatched it up instantly. "Jordan." Jordan's voice was calm. "Good evening, Michael." Michael closed his eyes briefly. "Where are you?" "Dinner." Michael exhaled slowly. "You shut down my airline." "No," Jordan said quietly. "I shut down my software." Michael leaned forward in the seat. "Jordan, we need to fix this." There was no anger in his voice now, only urgency. "Do you understand what's happening right now?" "Yes. Hundreds of flights grounded. Thousands of passengers stranded." "I'm aware." Michael gripped the phone tighter. "This is catastrophic." Jordan's voice stayed steady. "Earlier tonight, your crew told me I didn't belong in first class." Michael felt the words hit like cold water. Jordan, they removed me from a seat I paid $12,000 for. Michael said nothing. They threatened to call the police. Silence filled the car. Finally, Michael spoke. That should never have happened. Jordan didn't answer immediately. Across the restaurant, a waiter cleared plates from a nearby table. Glasses clinked softly. Normal sounds. Then Jordan said quietly, "But it did." Michael looked out the car window as Manhattan buildings passed by. "What do you want?" Jordan's answer came without hesitation. "Acknowledgement." Michael frowned. "You'll get an apology." "No." Jordan's voice sharpened slightly. "Not a private apology." Michael understood. "You want a statement?" "Yes." Michael leaned back slowly. "That will destroy us." Jordan didn't soften. "You destroyed yourselves." The car slowed as it turned onto Park Avenue. Michael looked through the windshield at the glowing entrance of the Four Seasons ahead. "Jordan," he said carefully, "if you don't restore the system tonight, this airline may not survive." Jordan's reply came softly. "Then you should move quickly." The line went silent. Michael stared at the phone for a long moment. Then the sedan rolled to a stop beneath the hotel entrance lights. The driver opened the door. Michael stepped out into the rain. Because somewhere inside that building sat the one man who had just brought an airline to its knees. Michael Carter stepped through the glass doors of the Four Seasons, with rain still clinging to his coat. The lobby was quiet. Soft lighting glowed across marble floors. A pianist played something slow in the corner lounge, while a handful of guests sat with drinks, completely unaware that an entire airline network had collapsed less than 100 miles away. Michael scanned the room. He spotted him immediately. Jordan Hayes sat near the window in a leather chair, one ankle resting over his knee, a small espresso cup in his hand, no tension in his shoulders, no urgency in his movements, just calm, the kind of calm only powerful people carried. Michael walked toward him. Jordan looked up before he even reached the table. "I figured you'd come in person," Jordan said. Michael pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "We have 50,000 passengers stranded tonight." Jordan took a small sip of espresso. "Yes." "Airports across the country are gridlocked." "Yes." "Our entire operation system is offline." Jordan placed the cup gently on the table. "I'm aware." Michael leaned forward. "Then turn it back on." Jordan studied him for a moment. "You want me to fix the problem your airline created?" Michael's voice was tired now. "I want to fix the mistake." Jordan's eyes sharpened slightly. "Which mistake?" Michael didn't hesitate. "The one where my crew decided they knew who belonged in first class." Jordan watched him carefully. "And what are you going to do about it?" Michael took a slow breath. "Whatever it takes." For the first time that night, Jordan leaned back slightly, considering the answer. Across the restaurant, the television above the bar continued replaying footage of crowded terminals and grounded aircraft. Jordan glanced toward it, then back to Michael. "Tomorrow morning," he said. Michael frowned slightly. "What happens tomorrow morning?" "A press conference." Michael's expression tightened. Jordan continued calmly. You and your CEO stand in front of the cameras and explain exactly what happened." Michael didn't respond. "You say that a passenger was removed from his seat because of how he looked, because your crew decided comfort for someone else mattered more than a paid ticket." Michael's jaw clenched. Jordan's voice remained steady. "You say the word discrimination." Michael stared down at the table. "And if we do that?" Jordan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "You get 48 hours. Michael looked up. "For what? To move your system somewhere else?" Michael blinked. "You're terminating the contract." "Yes. But the migration alone could take months." Jordan shrugged slightly. "Then you should have thought about that before your crew escorted me off an airplane." Silence settled between them. Finally, Michael nodded once. "You'll turn the network back on, for 48 hours. Michael stood slowly. "I'll have the statement ready by morning." Jordan picked up his espresso again. "Make sure the cameras are rolling." Michael walked toward the lobby doors without another word. Outside, the rain had stopped. Back at JFK, the cabin of Flight 9102 had turned quiet again. 3 hours had passed. Passengers slumped in their seats. Phones glowed faintly in the dim lighting. Victoria Langford no longer looked confident. Her makeup had smudged slightly beneath tired eyes. Across the aisle, Thomas Garrett watched her quietly. Finally, she spoke. "This is ridiculous." Thomas nodded. "Yes." She glanced toward him. "You're enjoying this?" "No." He paused. "I'm observing it." The cabin lights flickered once more. Then the engines shifted slightly in tone. Mark Reynolds looked up toward the cockpit door. A moment later, Captain Brooks stepped into the aisle. His voice carried through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received confirmation that our network systems are coming back online. We'll be taxiing back to the gate shortly." A ripple of relief moved through the passengers. Victoria leaned back with a long exhale. Thomas Garrett smiled faintly. "Looks like someone decided to be merciful." Victoria stared at him. "What are you talking about?" Thomas didn't answer. Because he already knew. Miles away in Manhattan, Jordan Hayes tapped one button on his phone. Across dozens of servers, the Orion Nexus network reconnected. Screens in the Dallas Operations Center flickered back to life. Green aircraft icons began returning to the map. Dispatch systems restarted. Crew schedules reappeared. Phones stopped ringing. Luis Ortega leaned back in his chair. "It's back." Carl Bennett let out a breath he had been holding for hours. Michael Carter watched the monitors slowly stabilize. But he knew something had changed forever. Because in 48 hours the system would disappear again. And next time there would be no one left to save them. 1 year later, the name Atlantic Crown Airways existed only in business case studies and bankruptcy filings. A single moment of arrogance had cost them billions. Jordan Hayes never spoke publicly about the night. He didn't need to. In the aviation world, his name had become something else entirely. A reminder. Respect wasn't optional. It was infrastructure. And sometimes the person everyone underestimated was the one holding the power switch. If this story made you think, take a second to like the video and subscribe for more stories like this. And in the comments, write 3 simple words that say everything this airline forgot. Respect everyone always.